Barnaby Joyce, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
You went to the election promising to scrap the school kids bonus and deliver an increase in superannuation to 12%. You're now keeping the school kids bonus for a couple more years at least, and you're delaying the superannuation increase. Are you really keeping your promises here?
Well, I think that's first and foremost, if the Labor Party had decided to go into negotiations with us, they could have got that. The Labor Party made a decision that they weren't going to negotiate, and then stood in shock and awe when we ultimately had to go out and negotiate with somebody else.
But you can't blame Labor for... They've stuck to what they said they'd do prior to the election.
Block everything.
Well, they said they wanted to keep the school kids bonus and the superannuation increase. You said you wanted to scrap the school kids bonus and keep the superannuation
Well, we've
increase.
had to negotiate because obviously the mining tax had to go. It was a key issue, just like getting rid of the carbon tax, just like turning around the finances of the nation. The Labor Party had completely within their power to say, well, if we're not happy where this is going, we can mitigate it by going into negotiations with the coalition. They chose not to do that. Therefore, they forced us into negotiations with the Palmer United Party, and we're thankful of that. At least we've got a process through acknowledging the complexities of the Senate, but that alternative was always before Labor to try and deal with that, and they chose not to do it.
But your government's decided to do a deal with Clive Palmer, which does essentially see those promises look a little shaky.
Well, we had to actually deal with Palmer to get the mining tax gone, because people said that it's our major export, and if we don't, if we put any sort of concerns around that section of our economy, it has huge financial ramifications for where our economy goes, especially when you realise now it's about 50% of coal mines are currently, in the current conditions, viable. You don't need to create any more reason for people not to go into that sector, because we know that it's the source of the money that turns our economy over.
It seems a lot of people agreed with that the mining tax wasn't working, had to go. But do you think they expected this would hit their superannuation? I mean, the figures are an average earner who's 40 years old is going to cost them around 20 grand.
Well, if I can just sort of deal with that. First of all, no super amounts going to super is actually going to be reduced. We're talking about prospective earnings in the future. The only time super accounts have actually gone down, and I don't blame them for this, but it was under Labor, when in 2008 they went down by about 12.5% by reason of the global financial crisis and global shares and what happened to super accounts and that. Now, people saying that super accounts are going to go down, no, they're not. People continue to contribute to them, and ultimately the levy that employers pay, it's not the government that pays it. Remember, your super is paid by
the employer.
Mine's paid by the employer, which is the Australian taxpayer. When I was an accountant, I paid for my staff super. When you're the hairdresser pays for the staff super. The panel beater pays for the staff super.
So the argument that it's now, which some of your colleagues have made, that it's going to end up in the workers' pocket instead, is that necessarily true?
Well, if there's an increase, if they look for a total salary increase and you don't have it in super, well, of course the employee gets it. And the employee has the opportunity, if they so wish, to make a voluntary contribution to super. If super is their issue, they just say, well, I'll just put that money into super. I mean, they can do that now.
Just on that point, though, for those earning low-income earners less than $37,000, and there'd be quite a few of those, I would imagine, in your electorate, they're also going to lose the low-income super contribution, which means they'll have to pay tax to put money into super. They don't actually pay personal income tax effectively. So there's not really an incentive to save for retirement there, is
Well,
there?
I think there's always an incentive to save for retirement because, as an accountant, the rough rule of thumb is this. You live on about 10% of what's in your super balance, and then you supplement that with pensions. That's a very rough rule of thumb. So, you've got to try as early as possible to start putting as much as possible towards your retirement. And luckily enough, we have about $1.8 trillion.
But should you have a tax incentive to do that? Shouldn't there be? Isn't that the whole point?
Well, overall there is. It's still vastly in your advantage to invest in super.
Not if you're on that low income, though.
But what you have in low income is a vast amount of other low income rebates that are still in place. I mean, it's ultimately, if you look at holistically that low income bracket, they are at a vastly greater tax advantage to anybody else, and so they should be too, because we want to make sure we help those at the bottom.
Can I ask you about some of the goodies for small business that were also tied to the mining tax that are going as well, about $4.5 billion in fact. In particular, the instant asset write-off for small business. A lot of farmers would have been using this, no doubt. It's going to go from $5,000 down to $1,000 now. And that means if you're buying a vehicle or a bit of equipment, you can't write off as much. Do you know when that will actually take effect? What should farmers do? Should they go out and buy something today, or...?
Well, I'm not going to start giving tax advice as much as I'd like to on your program, because I'd have to give a disclaimer with it, and preferably charge a fee for it, because I am an accountant.
Fair enough.
But look,
but this is a bit grey at the moment.
You know, well, obviously we'd be on passage and royal assent, and I'll actually look at that process when it arrives. I can't give you a conclusive.
What if they bought something this financial year?
That answer might be there, and maybe I don't know about it, so I'll admit my ignorance on that issue.
Okay, but if they bought something the last couple of months, are they okay to claim the $5,000?
Well, once more, if they bought something the last 5,000 months, prima facie, last 2 months, prima facie, I would say that because I don't believe that it's predated, but once more, I can stand to be corrected on that.
Right. There's a couple of other budget measures I wanted your thoughts on, in particular the focus from regional Australia, the higher education deregulation. What's it going to mean for the regional unis? Are you worried about that?
Well, I had a good conversation with Professor Annabelle Duncan yesterday from the University of New England about precisely this. And the message that I got through, that they told me, is the status quo can't stay. It's just not working. So we've got to do something from where we are. Deregulation will, in some instances, force a change of business, but does not necessarily mean a detriment to regional universities.
What would it mean to New England, do you think?
Well, the vast majority of students at the University of New England are external students who are their correspondence with universities via the internet, so it actually gives us a commercial advantage over other universities if they wish to jack up their fees. Remember, University of New England also has a campus at Parramatta, so there is this strategic advantage, and obviously the heart and soul of the University of New England is in Armidale, and the administration's in Armidale, so if they're doing more business in other areas, it also supports Armidale, and of course the soul of the university is the college system at the University of New England, and long may that be the case, and there'll always be people who want to go there and be part of that wonderful varsity experience, which is Armidale being the only true university town in Australia.
A great town too, but are you worried at all about the impact this might have on the regions and the fee changes as well? Are you looking for any special treatment?
Yes, and I think in the scholarship system that's been set up by the Minister Pine is going to be advantageous, because we know that if we can have a scholarship system that gives us the capacity to go to those areas which truly are at
so be targeted to regional areas.
And if someone's at Quilpie or Bawarrina or Gaduga, and you can give that person the capacity to get to university, noting full well that the real cost for them, the real imperative in their mind, is how do I pay for my boarding fees, how do I pay for my food, because I can't live at home with mum and dad, which an urban student can. An urban student can get on the train, go to university, come home at night, and the vast majority of their costs are covered, but in the country, that you have to move to where the university is, and therefore a lot of people say, well, to their parents, could you pay for it? And the parents honestly say, no, we can't, and therefore a decision is made not to go to university, and that's a bad outcome.
The fuel tax, how's that one going down? Is that a tough one to sell to people in the bush?
Well, any time you're trying to turn the finances of the nation around, you have to have an honest conversation with people and say, look, no matter what we do, somewhere, something is going to be cut, because if we don't turn the finances around, then rather than small changes being made now, in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time, we will go out the back door.
And but this one does hit those in the bush harder. They've got to drive a lot further.
Any decision hurts. Now, I'm not making an excuse for it. I say that, of course, it hurts. No matter where we go trying to change the budget round, something somewhere is going to hurt, because a person who did receives less, or in some instances, pays more. That is the nature of trying to turn the finances of the nation around. Once more, I say to people, if we hadn't been left in this invidious position by the previous crowd, we're over $330 billion in debt. And when they talk about going to $667 billion in 10 years' time, it doesn't stop there. It just continues sailing on to $1 trillion. It's just that the numbers become so ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
Given the ridiculous state of the numbers, then, how do you sell the paid parental leave scheme in your electorate?
Well, it's fully funded, and of course that has to, for us to live in our dotage in some form of financial security, we've got to have somebody out there who's willing to go through the process of having a child. Last examination, they're generally women, and therefore we've got to encourage women to have babies in all facets of life. And so often we see that certain people get themselves financially tied into a position where they say, I cannot afford to have a child. That's the statement that's made. By the time they get themselves to the position where they can afford to have a child, the great tragedy in life is many of them, and I've seen this amongst my own friends, unable to have a child.
So this is about encouraging the birth rate?
Yeah, absolutely, because you and I, if we have one person paying for our pension if we need it, those numbers just don't stack up. We have to have an expanding population.
What about immigration to do that?
You can do that as well. It's part of the process.
Less expensive than this, wouldn't it?
It's part of the process, but I think Australians overwhelmingly want the growth of our nation to come from within our nation and not be relying on somebody to come into our nation to support us.
Final question, wheat. Deregulation, I think it's the end of this month, isn't it? That the
Yep, if it doesn't happen by the end of this month, you go back to the default position.
Okay, and the West Australian Libs want full deregulation.
Well, I don't necessarily agree
Right.
with that. I think that we have a good deal which CBH, which is the Cooperative Bulk Handlers
West, yep.
from Western Australia, as they're a cooperative, I think they have a right to an exemption because any gain they make goes back to their growers. That is different to corporate entities, which of course any gain they make goes to their shareholders, as it should. So the motivations of these two parties are different. But if the cooperative goes out of their area into another area, well then they should be treated like any other corporation. So we're trying to, and I've been pursuing this process to make sure that the cooperatives in their own market are treated in one form, corporations are treated in another form, and we make sure that fairness is dealt back to the farmer.
So you'd keep some regulation, or keep regulation
Yes,
in place for port access fees, an exemption for CBH in the West.
For cooperatives, not just for CBH,
okay,
for cooperative.
Okay.
Because if you know that the way that wheat is set up in its transport and its storage is it's a natural monopoly. They're not going to build 2 railway lines, 2 ports, 2 handling facilities. There's a natural monopoly, and of course with a monopoly comes great strategic market advantage. And if you're unfair about it, you just say, well mate, this is the price, and if you don't like it, well this is the price, and sorry, you just got to suck it up.
Agriculture Minister Barnaby Joyce will have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.